maybe I'll ask the first one to kind of break the ice. If you were to do it again, if you were to go through the process of designing the survey and getting people ready for it and et cetera, would you do anything different?
From my perspective, we really did follow the steps of a modified Delphi process to enable the most insights and information that we could from a variety of individuals. We are, of course, missing, a whole bunch of other individuals in terms of who has completed the surveys. So, we focused on the staff, students, and faculty, but there's a community around the university that also supports student mental health, the families, the community partners and industries that could come in and continue to provide us with research priorities from different points of view. So 100% recognizing that, this is a starting point in terms of who we've heard from on these research priorities. So that would be one thing. I guess the other would be to find ways to have, as you may have seen when we were presenting the numbers of individuals who provided us with data. So they were on the lower end. They're still very consistent with Delphi processes. And as we all know, doing this kind of research where you're asking people to do multiple rounds of surveys is challenging. So finding ways in which we can include more and more diverse voices so that we could explore the data, looking at it specifically from, Taiwan and the UK and Canada, for example, and Australia, and seeing, how can we break apart these priorities further to see if some of the priorities are emerging higher for different parts of the world, or again, different entities like that. We can't do that with the data that we have. And so those would be some, caveats, I guess, to the data that we presented today.
Yeah, I would also agree with what Catherine is saying. And as I'm currently doing my PhD in evaluation, I'm finding that it's really hard to engage with people, especially if it's more long-term engagement that you're striving for. So I think that in future, it would be really great to explore, like Catherine said, more diverse, broader perspectives through perhaps the implementation of more mixed methods, not just surveys alone. And I think that is being done with the Global Student Summer Research Institute coming up. Getting people together into a room and actually talking and workshopping the results, I think will be way more informative, and discussions based is always more qualitatively rich. So I think there is a lot of things in the works that we can look forward to as well.
Great. I wonder one other thing, if I may mention, you talked about people, the students, faculty, and staff come to this with different perspectives. And I wonder if it would have been helpful to give everybody a sort of a literature review of what do we know, so that at least everybody's sort of starting from an equal footing when it comes to knowledge, and then go from there. Otherwise, the different perspectives are so interesting. But I wonder, did you find it a little frustrating too, as to know what to do next?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point around what knowledge exists and where the efforts have been. It also, to me, I wouldn't say it's frustrating. I would say in some ways it's enlightening, because it suggests that the different groups that we did conduct this research with have different knowledge and awareness of that knowledge. And so we can only suggest that, for example, that the student priority number one around effectiveness of interventions, that it may be that that there's a lack of awareness around or limited awareness around what interventions do exist. But it also means that those interventions aren't forward facing for those students. And so again, how do we get those interventions to be on the forefront of students' awareness, so that we can continue to adapt those interventions and build from them, rather than start with, we need more interventions and we need to explore the effectiveness. There's great interventions that exist, and probably many in the institutions that we're partnering with, that we can now build from and share resources and capacity, and build out these toolkits. And so I think of the different perspectives and the different ways in which people have come to fill out the survey as informative, because again, from a knowledge translation perspective, we have to focus on getting the information out to those who really need the information and want the information and can now use it to continue to move this space forward.
Great. So I just encourage people to put their questions into the Q&A.
If there aren't any questions, I would also suggest that we could, put back up the priority list and ask if anyone has any thoughts on how to address some of the priorities that have been identified from the various groups, because that is the next step in terms of, it's great to know what these priorities are, but now how do we go about addressing any of these priorities? So I would start with the students. These are the student priorities for student mental health, and it would be great to know from those in attendance of the webinar today, if you have any suggestions or comments around how to start to think about addressing any of these research priorities.
Great question. Can people speak, or do they have to write it in the Q&A? Here's a question. Do the authors have suggestions on how researchers can best engage students in the research process?
I think I can start off with that one, seeing that I am a student, but just want to disclose that I cannot speak for the entire student population as well. But I think that student engagement is always really difficult, but I think what's most important is to meet students where they are at. And I think that the expert advisory committee, because we had student representation in that group, there was a general sense of awareness of where students were at certain times of the year. For instance, when exam periods might be, when midterms assessments might be, etc. So I think there is that level of meeting students where they are at in their schedule, but also in the type of communication platforms that they might want to engage with. So I know that in the initial Delphi process, surveys were circulated, but what I'm particularly excited about is this opportunity to actually fly into a physical location in Toronto next month to meet with my fellow students that have been a part of the Global Consensus project more broadly, so that we can actually come together and brainstorm and have these unique perspectives from across the world and across disciplines of how we can improve student mental health research. So yes, I know that was a very long-winded way to answer, but I think it's really meeting students where they are at, physically as well as in terms of their schedule.
Good points. Here's a tough question. In regards to suicide attempt and ideations, are there any interventions or surveys to understand what coping mechanisms people use and how the university can support students in developing and implementing those healthful coping strategies?
It's a very good question. It's not something that we explored through this research process, because we were sort of identifying the research priorities, and of course suicide attempts and ideation did emerge as one of the top priorities for student mental health. What we don't capture in this process is then what is available, what are the supports. And so, this question, I would almost reframe it as, this is exactly where we would now need to go to start to address that priority, is to now explore conduct the scoping reviews or the systematic reviews around what are the interventions that do exist on campuses around the world to address suicide ideation or attempts, as well as what surveys are used in these spaces to be able to identify the coping mechanisms. I am aware of a couple of large, data collections that occur across North American universities, for example, the Achanatcha survey, and here in Canada, there is a campus well-being survey that exists, where there's very simple questions around some of these behaviors, but don't get at, I would say, any research, angles that would help us address them. It gives us good data from a descriptive perspective, but in terms of understanding the coping mechanisms, we have to dive deeper and use mixed methods research to be able to understand what that looks like. And again, great question to then address almost the priority that did emerge from this research.
Great. This so it's almost a dialectic between a whole university approach and then another approach targeting those who are at risk of self-harm, for example, or at risk of a mental illness or something. And sort of whole university approaches are interesting. I wonder if developing, or one of the attendees wonders about developing a guide for sort of best practices, and how difficult would that be? And could universities share it? Would it be similar across different universities, Australia, Taiwan, Canada, London, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, one of the big efforts of this, the larger group that Kristin is leading, is tied to being able to, almost build that foundation. So what I would suggest that there is a foundational guide that could exist that would then be adapted and modified based on the cultural context and the ratios of students and staff and faculty, and what do those contexts, the environmental, the cultural context look like at the various institutions around the globe to be able to address this. But with these research priorities and the Delphi process that we followed, what it does is it does give us a common ground to start from. So these research priorities are that common ground or that foundation. And if we start to consider the ways in which we can address them, that then builds something like a guide that could be started, and then going through a very similar process to what we did to identify the research priorities would happen to then identify what that guide could look like, at least at a foundational level.
Great. Here's an interesting question. How did COVID influence these priorities? So give us a little timeline about doing this, and COVID and university lockdown and opening up again. And was it different in Sydney than it was in Toronto? All those kinds of things.
I think, yeah, if I look at the slide, and maybe I can just share so everyone can see what I'm seeing as well. I think I think Catherine emphasized that students really prioritize the effectiveness of interventions, as well as the investigation of belongingness and identity. We can only assume that COVID had some sort of impact on these sorts of results, because it was circulated in a time of definite uncertainty, at least in Australia, and social isolation, which probably research shows that student mental health was severely impacted during those times. And I think what will be interesting is the long-term impacts of COVID. So now that universities are slowly starting to open up, what are students comfortable with, and what kind of research priorities might they have in the next year? Would it be the same, or would it have caveats instead? So I think, yes, definitely COVID probably impacted these research priorities, but it's hard to say how these would change. And I think that is the field of student mental health. It's constantly dynamic and changing, and we as researchers have that responsibility to adapt and keep listening to what people need.
And I would just add to that, I think that's a great response to how COVID impacted this. I also say that when we developed the priorities that we started with, what were based around an environmental scan of the existing literature that was published pre-pandemic. And so, if you look at where we started from, the literature that was published during the time in which we got this group together, were all, sort of studies and literature bases that were pre-pandemic. And so then we get the responses in more turbulent times. It wasn't at the heart of the lockdowns, but it was certainly when different parts of the world were certainly acting in different ways. And what we can see, what I take away from it is that even when we started with a certain, the 30 priorities that we started with, and ended with 33 research priorities through this process, we didn't get a lot of different responses that said that we were missing a big part based on COVID. So to me, it means that those priorities, there is a consistency or continuity to these research priorities that transcend these kind of turbulent times. Obviously, we have to start looking at how to address these priorities within a quote unquote post-pandemic sphere. But what I take away is that we didn't hear a lot of new research priorities that we missed because it was, during these COVID times, which is encouraging in some ways.
The questions are rolling in now, Catherine and Grace. There wasn't in your priorities, another person sort of asked, I'm going to formulate a question from what this person reported. And it wasn't, or was there, maybe I missed it, a discussion or a priority around the intersection between curriculum design, student work-life balance, and wellness and mental health? Did that come up in one of the priorities?
It was certainly in among the top 33 among the 33 priorities that we circulated for feedback. There was certainly around, the work-life balance and wellness and different programs of research or study and academics that students are in. It did not come through on the top 10 list for any of the staff, the students, or the faculty. So it was, part of the literature review that we did had this work-life balance as a certain top 30 priority, I would say. But no one identified it as, or within the group level data that we analyzed, it was not interpreted as one of the top 10.
You could see how this would interact with a sense of belonging and loneliness, like classes of 2,000 versus small seminar groups, for example, would have difference in that way.
Absolutely.
One attendee is asking a little more clarification about what actually is a whole university approach and what does that mean for student mental health? Can you give an example?
Yeah, so Kristin has nicely presented the definition that we have I think was taken from the survey itself in the chat. So a whole university approach recommends that all aspects of university life promote and support student and staff mental health. And so it really is this bringing together of all individuals on campus across the board in terms of addressing student mental health from whatever place that they're at, and the constituents and the perspectives and the context that they bring to student mental health.
And I think that's really encouraging because it's aligned with what we're trying to achieve in mental health research in general, where there is this I guess, push towards that no wrong door. So in the context of student mental health, there shouldn't be a wrong door for a student to receive mental health support on campus. So yeah, I think it's very encouraging as a student to see that there is this push for a whole of university approach.
Great. One attendee asks how they can help in the next steps going forward.
I would say stay tuned, stay involved, follow the, Inlight on social media. And obviously we have be in touch so that we have ways in which to contact everyone that is involved and that is interested in this space. We will be turning efforts towards addressing these research priorities, getting them through to publication so that they can be translated, so that knowledge translation efforts can be made, so that, we're almost identifying what's next for researchers in this space, and would love to be involved and to have insights into how people will use these data moving forward. So a platform of sharing, as well as, if depending on who the person is, if there's students that want to get involved, being a part of the various student related activities that we have going on, really there'll be a lot more outreach as we move ahead with these next steps in this process.
Thank you. More questions? Do you guys, Catherine, Grace, want to perhaps leave us with words of wisdom?
Grace, you take it.
As the sun is rising in Australia.
As the sun is rising in Australia, yes. I think it is in line with what Catherine just said. It's to stay engaged. And I know that might be really hard to do from a perspective of a student. And I think so often when you have student representation on these types of voices, you do have one particular voice, and that's like that student UN type voice who's really actively engaged. But I think the need for diverse perspectives, especially student perspectives, is going to be really integral moving forward. So stay engaged, and no experience is above another. So I think that what Catherine just said is really, really integral.
And I would add to that one takeaway would be to, get involved in these big research initiatives. Kristin has been an amazing leader on, in particular on these initiatives, and, it almost imbues the whole university approach right from the beginning of the funding that was received, and this team collaborative efforts. I can't say enough about being willing to share, resources and knowledge and information. And if, one university or one researcher has developed a program that's working, if it's willing to be shared, it goes a long way, because we continue to reinvent and use resources that could otherwise be spent, addressing the other half of those priorities, when we're stuck trying to, continue to replicate what could be just shared and evaluated in the various contexts. And that's where I could see, moving around in this student mental health space.
Great. Well, on behalf of all the attendees, Catherine and Grace, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation and exciting results. I'll hand it back to Kristin.